Is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
Honourable David Parker.
Thank you for your tolerance, Mr. Speaker, and my wit. I rise to speak in support of the IMF legislation. A couple of points to be made, sir. First of all, what's happening here is because of the change in the relative wealth of nations, the split of the payment that is made to the IMF that goes to support countries in trouble is changing because the relative weight of different countries has changed. China is a bigger part of the world economy. New Zealand is a smaller part of the world economy. It's a sad reflection on New Zealand's relative lack of growth compared with other parts of the world over recent decades that our share of world output has dropped. And that's not just because of changing population trends, that's because we haven't performed as well as some other countries. So on the one hand, the allocation of the amount to be spent by the IMF is changing in a way which decreases New Zealand's share of it as other countries' share increases. But on the other hand, the total amount of the pool that is able to be spent through the IMF is growing. And so the net effect for New Zealand's cost-wise is that we pay a smaller percentage of a larger amount, which works out to be about the same as it was previously. So there's not a great additional cost to the New Zealand taxpayer as a consequence of this. Mr. Speaker, it's notable that New Zealand generally does support the work of the International Monetary Fund, and I think that would cause me to reflect on the fact that the International Monetary Fund Chief Economist, Olivier Blanchard, thinks that monetary policy that focuses on inflation targeting to the detriment of other aspects of economic management is past its use-by date. So I would, whilst supporting this bill, note that the current government, the national-led government, is a bit selective as to the advice it takes from the International Monetary Fund. The IMF thinks that New Zealand's economy would be improved if we had broader targets for the Reserve Bank, so that instead of putting the primacy of control of inflation ahead of all other matters of economic management, they would have a broader set of objectives, including the health of our export sector and our exchange rate. Now, why, Mr. Speaker, is that important? That's important for New Zealand because unless we address some of these fundamentals, New Zealand is going to do next year and in the next decade what we've done in the last 3 decades, which is import more than we export, or to be more specific, not cover the costs of our imports and interest from the value of our exports. Mr. Speaker, every year New Zealand does that. We run a current account deficit or a balance of payments deficit. That external deficit, as it's sometimes called, can only be that hole can only be plugged in 2 ways. It's either through borrowing more money from overseas or by selling assets that were previously New Zealand owned to a foreign buyer. And New Zealand's been doing that now consistently for over 3 decades, and as a consequence our net international liabilities grow. Mr. Speaker, unless New Zealand has an exchange rate which reflects the fundamentals of our economy, we will not be able to overcome that current account deficit, and we will continue to get poorer as our net international liabilities grow every year. The Treasury's projections on behalf of the government in the latest budget have New Zealand's net international liabilities growing to negative 80% of GDP over the forecast period ending in 2016. Those net international liabilities are already high by international standards. Indeed, you would have to say that they are at European levels and they are set to get worse. So, in order for that not to happen, New Zealand would have to earn more in its exports relative to its imports and interest costs, and in order to do that we need a few changes. The IMF says we should be introducing a capital gains tax. The government rejects that advice. The IMF, like the OECD and the Treasury and the Reserve Bank and just about every other Western government, think it's a good idea because then people will invest on the basis of the profitability of an enterprise rather than a tax bias that lies in favour currently of certain classes of investment. And that acts to the detriment of our productive export sector because too much money goes into land-based purchases and not enough money into export-related businesses, be they services or manufacturing exports. those businesses suffer as a consequence of the bias that puts too much emphasis on other parts of the economy. The IMF also says that inflation targeting has been exposed by the global financial crisis as being wrong or inadequate, and thinks that broader targets are needed for countries, so that instead of just focusing on the control of inflation, other matters of economic management are important. Now, Stephen Joyce on the other side has insulted people who have been pursuing this alternative viewpoint recently, be they manufacturers or politicians. He's accused them of voodoo economics, of being snake oil merchants, but of course you can't accuse the head of the IMF, Olivier Blanchard, of that, nor various Nobel laureates who think that inflation targeting has run its course. I met recently with a number of these economists overseas, including a renowned expert in monetary policy, Jeffrey Frankel at Harvard. He made a couple of statements to me that I found common sense, to be honest. He said, no one system of monetary policy is right for all countries of the world. It's obvious. And no one system of monetary policy is right for any one country all of the time. Again, it seems pretty common sense thing to say. And if you look back at the history of the world, we've actually gone in the last century through a number of iterations of monetary policy. Until the Great Depression and World War II, we had the gold standard, which was the way in which monetary policy was effectively controlled. That ran out of time, it stopped working properly, and so post-World War II and the Great Depression we had Bretton Woods, and we introduced a different form of control which focused on exchange rates and had capital controls or capital movement controls as part of it. That stopped working, and then as a consequence the world moved on and they tried to control monetary policy mainly through controlling the supply of money. That ran out of rope, and then the world moved on to inflation targeting. Inflation targeting, when introduced in New Zealand, was probably appropriate. We had entrenched inflation under Muldoon. We had real problems in the economy, and they needed to focus on the control of inflation being the primary problem. So the Reserve Bank was charged with fixing that problem, and they were told the primary aim was the control of inflation. Other things were subsidiary, like the exchange rate. Now that's run out of rope. It's no longer necessary. In fact, it's hurting New Zealand to give primacy to inflation targeting over other aspects of management of the economy. There is no doubt that the Reserve Bank would make different choices if their objectives were broader than giving primacy to inflation targeting. If other matters of economic management were given equal weighting, including the health of our export sector and our ability to earn enough in our exports so that we didn't have a current account deficit, well, New Zealand would be better off with the Reserve Bank using the tools at their disposal differently. So that's one of the lines of advice that we're having from the International Monetary Fund that is being ignored by this government. And I want to say one further thing about this legislation, and that is that although Labor will be supporting this bill, we would prefer that the ability to change the ratios or the amount that is committed to be contributed by New Zealand to the International Monetary Fund, future changes to that should be by way of statute that come before this Parliament rather than by statutory regulation as is proposed by this legislation. Until now, any time there has been an amendment to the articles of the International Monetary Fund that New Zealand agrees to, it's had to come before this Parliament, and the Minister of Finance has had to justify to this Parliament why that should happen. It has consequences for New Zealand in a monetary sense, and those consequences should be brought before Parliament so that Parliament has the opportunity to vote it up or down. Now, in reality, it's very unlikely that Parliament will vote it down unless the agreement that the Minister has entered into is wrong. The Minister will have the Treasury benches, and so will have the government's votes to vote it through anyway if he's convinced his own cabinet and caucus that that's the thing to do. So what is wrong with having transparency around these issues and requiring these amendments to come before Parliament? They don't happen every year. If this was just an administrative thing that happened every year, well, yeah, do it by way of statutory regulation, but it's not. In fact, I think the number of times that this legislation has been amended since it came into force just after Bretton Woods, because the International Monetary Fund was formed after Bretton Woods, is only about 4 or 5 times, so it's not like once a decade legislation is too much for this parliament to cope with. We oppose the regulation-making power.
Mr. Speaker.
Todd McClay.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. It is a pleasure to speak.